Good afternoon, everybody. You're all very welcome to the final talk of term of the Conspiracy and Democracy Research Project, which I think you all know is a 5-year funded Leverhulme project, which is led by our principal investigators, Richard Evans, John Norton, and David Runciman. And so this is the last talk of term. We have a website, conspiracyandemocracy.org, where you have all the upcoming events, which will be for next term now. But we try to do fun things, including a conspiracy film season, so you're all very welcome to come to all of our talks. It's my great pleasure to have as our last speaker of this term Professor Samuel Moyn, who's currently the James Bryce Professor of European Legal History at Columbia, but very soon to be the Professor of Law at Harvard. And he's well known to, I think, to most of the people here in the audience for his work on the intellectual history of human rights, but today he's going to talk about another one of his interests, and one that I'm also slightly more interested in, which has to do with contemporary French political theory from the mid-20th century onwards. And his talk, as you can see here, is Democracy Conspiratorial, François Furet and the Debate of the French Revolution. So just to give you a quick, the format is going to be as follows. Sam's going to speak for 45 minutes. Then one of the postdoctoral research fellows associated with the project, Andrew Mackenzie-McCard, will give a brief response to which Sam, if he likes, can respond, and then we'll open to discussion. And there'll be a wine reception, of course, afterwards. So, without any further ado, Sam, over to you.
Well, thank you, Hugo, and thanks to you all for coming. I really need to begin by registering my debt to the Conspiracy and Democracy Project for inviting me and hosting me with so welcoming a manner and in such a sumptuous way, actually. The truth is, while I've been here, I've been struggling to figure out how to discharge this now massive debt. The truth is, I've thought slightly about democracy, but never and not at all about conspiracy, and I've learned a lot from my time. And what I've done is, as has just been mentioned, is return to some older work about French political thought to try to think about the possible connection of conspiracy and democracy. Agonizingly, I'm just going to speak about a single book and give a pretty philological and even textual talk. And I should start then by giving some reasons why you might want to know about this book, namely François Furet's Interpreting the French Revolution, which originally appeared in 1978. Well, I think for one thing, there's the fact of its sheer influence. It destroyed a vision of the meaning of the French Revolution as a bourgeois affair, and put another in its place. I think its impact is hard to overstate within its field. Most of us make no difference as scholars or make an incremental difference. Some of us try to reorient discussions and miserably fail, as I've done with respect to human rights. Furet succeeded. He really did bury a dominant view of what the French Revolution was about. And the vision of it he put in its place, I think, has been surprisingly enduring. It was very exciting to scholars of the French Revolution for at least a generation. When I talk to such historians, and I'm not one, many of them will complain about its endurance, will wish for a new paradigm shift, such as the one that Furet brought about, but sadly they say no one's been influential enough to accomplish such a shift, even though many have tried. Finally, of course, there could be the justification that the French Revolution was long regarded, should possibly still be regarded as the most important political events in modern times. But I recognize that all of these reasons are limited. You have to be interested in European history and its radiance in modern political history. More relevant for today, I think, is the fact that in Furet's book, we not only find theories of democracy and conspiracy, but we find two different theories of democracy, one of which makes conspiracy almost a fundamental feature of democracy, or even viewed democracy as necessarily conspiratorial. And what I want to do is just disentangle some of the sources in the making of the book. Basically, I'm going to argue that there were two main sources, two different approaches to what democracy is. One of those sources didn't make anything of conspiracy, but the other made it central, or even, as I say, defined democracy as a kind of conspiracy. Maybe more subversively, I'm going to suggest that this second view that makes democracy and conspiracy close or identical has its sources in the counter-revolutionary attack on the French Revolution, which has haunted it from its inception. Furet was one of the most famous figures of his time. He is now the subject of multiple biographical projects. One by Christophe Prochasson, I put here, you see, has recently appeared, and another much better one by Michael Christofferson is in process. If you're interested in the salacious details of Furet's background, we are learning some tidbits. There's the interesting matter of his familial connection to the aristocracy of northwestern France, and therefore to one of the hearts of the counter-revolution in the Vendée, although his family was various. We've also learned that he deserted the Liberation Army of France in 1944, a choice which apparently haunted him for a long while. But most people would say that the key facts about Furet's biography is that he became an ardent communist and left the party, and really spent the rest of his life, including in his French Revolutionary studies, processing this decision. He mattered not solely or even really as an intellectual. I think he was chiefly a derivative thinker, but as someone who applied others' ideas, and above all, maybe as a journalist and impresario. He eventually became the president for a long time of the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, and exerted a very massive influence. People said at the time he had a galaxy of those who wheeled around him. But we won't focus on those matters in this talk, since we're interested in these core themes. The first thing I want to say is that this book is not really a book. And it's surprising when you read all of the literature on it that no one starts, I think, where we should, that it's a composite project. And it really comes in two halves that date from very different moments, both in Furet's own trajectory and in French intellectual and political history. If you've read it, you'll recall that it begins with a centerpiece essay called "The French Revolution is Over." And then it turns to historiographical essays. One on the so-called Revolutionary Catechism, a very famous attack on Marxist historiography of the revolution. An essay on Alexis de Tocqueville, whom he approached as a brilliant theorist of the continuity between the absolutist state and the centralizing habits of the revolutionaries themselves. And finally, there was an essay on someone few had heard of, frankly, one Augustin Koshan, to whom I'll return in a bit. The crucial fact, I think, about this composite book is that the attack on Marxism, as well as the essay on Tocqueville, had been written early in the later 60s, around 1970. In the Tocqueville essay, for example, for a Festschrift for les Moirons. And at that point, Furet was known chiefly as a quantitative historian in the Annales tradition, had worked on literacy, for example. Something happened to him in between 1970 and 1977 when he appears in a kind of white heat to have written the remainder of the book. And I think the crucial parts, his general interpretation of the revolution in The French Revolution is Over, and this strange revival of Augustin Koshan. What happened to him over those years? Well, I think there's a lot to say about this. Maybe most importantly in motion was his whole way of thinking about politics and history. As I mentioned, he was known, to the extent he was known, as a quantitative historian. Then in this book, he says he's doing something called the conceptual history of politics, which is a very interesting development. I may say slightly more about that later. We're interested in the substance. For a long time, French revolutionary historians have struggled to explain how the promise of emancipation in 1789 could have led to terror, thanks to the Jacobins. Furet, interestingly, in the later 60s and in 1970s said he wasn't sure how to explain this fundamental problem. He used this metaphor in a kind of coffee table book he wrote with his brother-in-law named Denis Richet in 1977. He said the revolution skidded out of control into the terror. So he uses like a metaphor of dérapage or skidding to explain the dynamic of the revolution, what happened once it set off. In 1977, when he writes his new materials, he has a completely different and very insistent view that the reason the terror occurred is democracy itself. Now, many of us may have read R.R. Palmer or know Yaakov Talmon's book, but the one Furet didn't know about. The other, I think, it was not very important for Furet. And what's interesting when we look at the text of the book is how often he repeats the term democracy and insists that it's democracy itself that what was most fundamentally at stake in the revolution. He says in the closing passages, I think, of the preface that the central mystery of the revolution is that it's the origin of democracy, and he also credits it with being the first experiment. In a more sinister way, he said the chief terrorist, Maximilien Robespierre, is most fundamentally a Democrat, and we can read what democracy is and some of its possible outcomes through the career of terrorists. Well, how did he get these views? I've explored this a bit in prior work, and I think he is light years away by 1977 from his original thinking. I apologize, forgive me, I have to take a brief excursion into continental political thought, which would be unpopular here, but I think on reflection proves to be the chief source of some of the central ideas of Furet's text, I think unbeknownst to the near totality of his readers across the last 40 years or so. I'm not going to dwell on who Claude Lefort was. He was one of the, I think, chief democratic theorists of the past half century. He recently died himself, as you can see. He was friends with Furet, and Furet in this period actually got him a job at this école that Furet, of which Furet became the president. I'm going to give a very brief version of what Lefort's central ideas were in order to try to convince you of how fundamental Furet's debt was to this body of democratic theory and this quantum leap Furet took between 1970 and 1977. So I think his central claim is as follows. The people who rule in a democracy don't exist. The people, only exists imaginatively, or in a word Lefort liked to use, symbolically. Obviously, individual people exist, and for that reason, the social order is inescapably diverse. But we nonetheless we'd like to say that under a regime of popular democracy, the people rule. What that really means, of course, we know, is that the people have to be represented. The people who are absent, though they rule, have to be represented by some people, some group of people. We have elections to create this representations, but presumably there are other ways. So Lefort's thinking, let's say, revolved around this paradox, which I think has become much more familiar in the spike of work in political theory these days on the problem of representation. The people have to be represented somehow to have any voice. On the other hand, that voice is authoritative only insofar as it's a representative claim, and we have to stake out how we vindicate the claim of some representative to authentically speak for the people. You put it another way, Lefort was interested in the dynamics that get set off by what he called the disincorporation of politics. So in his idea, drawing on other theorists, in the old days under monarchy, politics was incorporated. The ruler had a body. Under democracy, there's nobody, or if you like, everybody rules, but there's no site of power to which to point. Only representatives who claim or are anointed representatives of the people who rule. One of his most famous phrases in this vein is that, unlike in monarchy, authority in a democracy is an empty place. People can try to fill it, but no one can ever be the people, only represent the people. And from that very fact, it follows that representation is always imperfect. It's going to be possible to claim some better possible approximation of the people or their will. One of his students is a current professor at the Collège de France named Pierre-Rosan Vallon, written a book trying to apply these sorts of insights, many books actually. The book I have in mind is called Le Peuple Introuvable, basic idea being that in French history we can read it as a struggle to find the people when ultimately, by nature, they can't be found. It can't be found. So the funny thing is, when we look back, Claude Lefort hadn't ever thought about the French Revolution. He developed this theory thinking about Soviet communism, which he called totalitarianism. And he himself wanted to conceive of totalitarian rule as democratic. It's very important to note that. In his argument, which he developed thinking about Stalin and reading Solzhenitsyn ultimately, what totalitarians do is try to abolish the difference between the symbolic and the real, or to make the unity of the people a real thing. And of course, in part, that takes the place of finding the enemies of the people and killing them, which of course the Soviets did. Now you see, I think we're very close to a possible interpretation of the terror. And what I want to explore is how close and what new principles Furet had to take on board to get there. So the first thing I want to say is that if we read the book correctly and translate it with some of its sources better known, we find just a huge number of telltale allusions to Claude Lefort's political theory. No shame that none of us had known that. Lefort was a cipher, whereas Furet was famous, and we disdained and lumped together, as postmodernism, French thought in general. I think this is actually quite sad that we did this as historians, because it's a hugely diverse body of thought, some interesting, some not. But we did that, and as a result, I think we were ill-positioned to understand a text like Furet's that had massive impact. Sometimes it had impact by a kind of perversion of the argument, and I think this university had something to do with that. I know I'm digressing. I've debated with one or another of you whether Professor Skinner himself was a linguistic idealist at the time in the middle of his career. But Keith Michael Baker, who was Furet's chief follower in French revolutionary historiography, certainly was. Keith Baker says things in his text like social and political changes are themselves linguistic, and thought that by reconstituting political language, we would already have done the work of understanding the revolution in practice. Actually, Furet never believed such a thing. That was, in a sense, invented by Anglo-Americans, constructing what they thought French thought was supposed to be about. But this is a hobby horse that I need not detain us for now. The moment in which Furet made this application of Lefort's theory, for that's, I think, what happened in interpreting the French Revolution, was very fraught. And I think we have to get a sense of what was going on. Furet considered himself on the left at this point. It was a moment in which he and many other progressive intellectuals feared for the fate of socialism, because the Socialist Party had decided to enter an electoral alliance with the Communist Party, still very powerful. That was called the Union of the Left. And in a way, attacking the French Revolution as a totalitarian event proved, let's say, an expression of anxiety on the part of these intellectuals about what might happen if the socialist joined up with the communists and captured power, as actually did take place when Mitterrand rose to power. What I think was sad, given the very long-term impact, far beyond Paris, of Furet's text, is, as I now want to argue, Furet drove Lefort's thinking in a new direction. And it was precisely by supplementing it, or let's say adulterating it, with a theory of conspiracy. I think this move, as I'm going to try to reconstruct it now, was his own. I've mentioned that Lefort was very interested in totalitarian violence. However, Furet gave us an interpretation of the French Revolution and maybe democratic politics more broadly that made terror almost a necessary outcome of democracy. And I want to suggest that was because he drew on another source in composing his book, and that was conspiracy theory. So I'm now trying to get at his approach to so-called revolutionary dynamic, in which, according to this school, the claim to popular rule in 1789 makes 1793 and the terror a foregone conclusion. So one big step in this move involved a claim about the way that democracy will almost necessarily lead to elite rule. And in fact, this does seem relatively uncontroversial. It was much mooted by some people whom Hugo has studied, like Mosca, Michels, Pareto, Ostrogorsky in the early part of the 20th century. These figures were actually revived by Furet and others to explain how paradoxically the creation of a democratic society can lead to new forms of elite rule. And I think this is, let's say, an understandable move to make within democratic theory. It's been done many times, and we might still want to make it. Any representational attempt in practice of the abstract people will, almost by definition, involve the rule of some people over everyone else. I think this is the kernel of truth in elite theories of democracy. But I want to insist that it's a far cry from that basic and very abstract, and you might say simple, claim to Furet's argument that terroristic elites necessarily rose in the French Revolution as a result of the birth of democracy, and that terror haunts democracy as a general risk. I think you see this sort of claim in the last quotation on the slide. Small militant groups, specialists in democratic surrealism, are the necessary outcome of democratic politics. There's an inner circle of democracy, an anonymous oligarchy, a company of shadowy men, which actually Brissot, Danton, and Robespierre were not. I think already the language, the allusion to the sort of elite that's going to rule, a company of shadowy men, already sounds conspiratorial. And what I want to suggest is it actually was. So now I turn to my second source of Furet's ideas in this epoch-making book, very simply the counter-revolutionary tradition of the conspiratorial origins of the French Revolution. That, as you probably know, certainly the members of this project know, dates from the very famous conspiracy theory of the abbé Barruel, who claimed in the direct aftermath of the French Revolution that a cabal of men with a conspiracy back to the age of the Knights Templar and culminating in the Masonic lodges and intellectual societies had nefariously seized power. He did leave one group out, of course, and that was the Jews. But this omission was quickly remedied in the 19th century by one Jean-Baptiste Simonini, who claimed that Barruel got everything right except for the Jewish sources of Masonry and the conspiracy in general. I assume this is a master text of this project, but if you like this sort of thing, you can read Umberto Eco's novel Foucault's Pendulum, which is essentially a kind of riff on all of these conspiracy theories. The Prague Cemetery as well, which is more Jewish, but Barruel actually figures very heavily, and so does Simonini in Foucault's Pendulum. What happened to that tradition? Well, it was extremely influential in the 19th century, and paved the way for some rather nasty events in the 20th. Furet didn't allude to Barruel, or if he did, negatively. Instead, as I've already mentioned, he revived very intentionally as a kind of seer of the explanation he wanted to advocate in the place of Marxism, this other man, Augustin Koshan. Koshan lived about a century later. You can see him here. He was wounded in World War I several times and eventually was killed in World War I. He was an aristocrat, very wealthy, independent scholar, and wrote some very interesting books that were dismissed in their time as just conspiracy theories in the tradition of the Abbé Barruel. And this was, of course, a dismissal done by the Marxist left, but also by more liberal types like Alphonse Hollard. One interesting, question that surfaced is where Koshan came to Furet's attention. This is a small mystery within this admittedly tiny group of people who might care about this question. The most influential story, which even Richard Tuck, when I had coffee with him the other day, repeated to me, is that Furet began coming to the United States and he discovered open stacks. And in the University of Michigan open stacks, he found Koshan, and the die was cast for our time. I find that explanation very dubious. I think there's a much better explanation. For one thing, Koshan was not unknown, although he was the stock and trade of some pretty unsavory characters. I think there's a much better explanation, which is that Reinhart Koselleck told Furet about Koshan. And in fact, we find a kind of live tradition in the 20th century of Koshan idolatry that we can trace back from Furet through Koselleck to Carl Schmitt, a well-known counter-revolutionary, proudly counter-revolutionary. I've dug up this quotation in which in the 50s, Schmitt records in this diary that he has Koshan in his intellectual pantheon. And of course, he was Koselleck's teacher. Koselleck wrote a very famous book of his own about the French Revolution, or the Enlightenment origins of the French Revolution, called Critique and Crisis. Furet and Koselleck met at least as early as the later 60s, and they even collaborated on another coffee table book that was published in German and French. It's true that Furet didn't, and as far as I know, never read German. So I can't claim that Furet actually read Koselleck's book. However, I don't think it's too far a stretch to think that on one of the many visiting stints that Koselleck did in Paris under Furet's auspices in the later 60s and early 70s, Furet learned of the, I think, central importance for this group of intellectuals of Koshan. In the end, it's a mystery, or at least I don't know how to solve it. He may in some of his summer research, and wouldn't that be a nice outcome? I had originally intended to talk about Koshan's own views, about Koselleck's own views, which I think intersect with Koshan. I'm going to skirt that for interest of time and not to bore you. But I do want to stop for a second to make my own an argument that Carlo Ginzburg once made about Koselleck. In a footnote to one of his books, Ginzburg says, Koselleck strives to distinguish his views from the counter-revolutionary tradition founded by Barruel, but in fact, he's merely reworked it cleverly. And essentially, I want to say the same thing about Furet. Now, in absolute fairness, Koshan denied being part of Barruel's tradition, and Furet, following him, denied reviving Barruel's conspiracy theory. And I essentially want to answer those claims as one in the famous British phrase, they would say that, wouldn't they? We have to look at how exactly they tried to skirt the implication that they were also drinking at the well of conspiracy theory. But in the end, I want to show they did so. So when Koshan and Furet following him talked about, Koshan and Furet following him talked about Barruel, the counter-revolutionary tradition, they dismissed it as simplistic. It merely postponed the crucial explanation of how the French Revolution had come to pass and taken the form that it did. If we just say that the French Revolution is the result of a nefarious cabal, we haven't explained anything, really. Koshan called this a psychological interpretation, which haunts most views of conspiracy. It may name a group of people in league, but doesn't explain why they're doing what they're doing. It amounts to the claim, if you like, that conspirators conspire. And so what Koshan did and what Furet celebrated in Koshan's work was at least claim to pivot beyond a conspiracy theory to explain revolutionary outcomes. I'm going to insist that nonetheless they cleverly reworked that theory. How did they claim to pivot beyond the old Barruel theory? Well, Koshan, and this is very interesting, loved sociology. He was a royalist, a Catholic, and so on, but he loved Emile Durkheim and insisted that we have to develop a sociological view to understand why revolution happened. So I think pioneeringly, and Furet wanted to follow this in particular, Koshan developed a so-called sociology of revolution. Let's explore it. The basic view is as follows. The philosophers and masons of the Enlightenment believed in freedom and equality. They enacted them in their little societies and lodges in a playful form, separate from power. They prefigured democracy, but without actually being sovereigns. In fact, one of Furet's disciples named Daniel Gordon has written a book in this spirit called Citizens Without Sovereignty, and this captures the basic view. In Masonic lodges and intellectual societies, democracy was born, but separate from power. And they were able to engage in self-rule precisely in virtue of this fact. And then things went wrong, because the citizens without sovereignty got it. And terror ensued. Why? Well, the basic claim is that there's the real world. There's the dense world of feudal institutions and society, and the new sociability that the Democrats are enacting clashes with those holdovers. And they have to be the ideals of democracy that the Masons and intellectuals are living out. If they're to really control society, will have to be imposed on it. That's essentially the sociability argument of the democratic revolution. Crucially, then, unlike plain conspirators, these intellectuals and Masons have no secret plan. They just want to be Democrats. But they nonetheless wreak havoc because their sociability makes them do it. So summarizing, the terror follows when democracy at the level of ideas and, let's say, local practices takes the form, which it, I think, necessarily does in this approach of militant social organization, which brings violent rule to society. That happens in France unexpectedly when the revolution breaks out, but that's why the terror ultimately follows kind of inexorably from the idea and episodic practice of democracy in these Enlightenment spaces. Okay, I'm not suggesting this is a good theory of the French Revolution, even though it did conquer, modern historiography. Mike Sonnenscher, he sent me a piece that dates, I believe, from 30 years ago, and he observes very cannily that this move to sociability, in a sense, repeats the tautology that the psychological approach had. At best, it just begs the question of where democratic sociability came from, if that's what's to be blamed for terror. I'm going to make a different objection in the spirit of, our gathering, which is that Koshan's theory, which became Furet's, really just reworks the conspiracy theory that it purports to reject. So the effect of the democratic sociability theory is the claim that goes way beyond an oligarchy theory of democracy, that the very idea of democracy as popular self-rule will breed terror thanks to a few shadowy men, even though they lack a foreordained intention, will necessarily be driven to act as a cabal, capturing politics and driving it in violent directions. If you want, you could see this sociability claim as a reworking. If you like, it makes the hand of conspiracy invisible. It makes conspiracy an imminent product of social action rather than the conscious intention of actors themselves. If you like, you could even see it as a reverse social theodicy of the kind Adam Smith offered. Social action beyond anyone's intentions drives terrible rather than beneficial consequences. But it seems to me, even if you want to be favorable towards the sociability theory, that its content is very close, in the end, too close to a conspiracy theory. And we see that when we look at Furet's texts. It's absolutely true that one of the novel moves that Koshan's approach allowed for Furet, indeed allowed Koshan in the first place, was to make conspiracy itself in the era of the French Revolution a topic of study and theory. One of the main, I think, contributions of both authors was to observe the importance of the revolutionaries' obsession with the so-called complot aristocratique, aristocratic plot, of which the revolutionaries were terrified and which drove their actions. And Koshan and Furet following him made this paranoia central to understanding the revolution. And it's true that the French revolutionaries were paranoid. It's also true, to adapt Professor Olmsted's title, that they had real enemies. But when we look at the way that Furet wanted to understand both revolutionary activity in general and these ideas about plots that the revolutionaries harbored in particular, I think we can't fail to notice how conspiracy theory has infected his own description of the revolutionaries. So this quotation, I think, is a quite illuminating one. Koshan's analysis contains a theory of ideology and a theory of politics. Ideology makes some aspects of society nefarious, using them as reference points for the militant action that must combat and exclude the wicked in order to recreate the philosophical society's consensus. He refers to necessary manipulation, secrecy, that small groups of activists, namely the revolutionaries, must take up. And it's this that makes them a hidden oligarchy. Well, I think this goes way beyond just a plain oligarchy theory of democracy. And we can see that in his attribution of the secrecy that these groups, through which these groups ruled, and the wickedness. So it's not just that the revolutionaries themselves saw hidden plots that were nefarious, but in Furet's view, they themselves were hidden and nefarious. And it's hard not to see this as an infiltration in Furet's own argumentation of the counter-revolutionary view. So I've been arguing this talk just to remind you that Furet had two main sources. He took one democratic theory, that's Lafordian theory, and fused it with a counter-revolutionary theory that equated democracy with conspiracy, or saw in the one the necessary source of the other. Now, I don't want to rule out that this created a very powerful interpretation. I think it speaks for itself that many people have allowed on publication Furet to command the historiography of revolution, and as I said, down to our time. It's possible that these two theories were mutually improved. It's true, for example, that Claude Lefort never had a very good theory of revolutionary violence, why it was that Stalin and his henchmen purged their society of so many so-called class enemies. Nonetheless, I'm going to suggest in closing that Furet actually damaged the one theory by fusing it with the other. Just one last time, let me show you this fusion taking place. It's in one of Furet's central discussions of the role of the plot in the French Revolution. You can see in this quotation the Lefortian element. The idea of the plot came into being when the field of power, having become vacant, was taken over by the ideology of democracy, that is, by the premise of popular sovereignty. Well, all of that is straight Lefortian thought. Nothing wrong with it, you might say. But in action, I think, thanks to the conspiracy theory tradition that Furet is embedding, this ideology slides quickly or necessarily to violence inflicted by a shadowy cabal, itself paranoid about a shadowy cabal. Let me then turn to some conclusions. I think one sign, very clear sign, that the entanglement of separate arguments is what was most at stake in the publication or the creation of Furet's book, as I've tried to philologically examine it here, is that, of course, Lefort was alive and himself read it. And he published a very interesting review, probably the best review in the Annales in 1979. And he noticed what had happened. Actually, to be frank, he was very loyal to Furet for getting him a job. And he was probably celebrating the fact that Furet was in the process of making Lefortian theory world famous. That's what happened, albeit under Furet's own name. And yet, Lefort bridled on some crucial points. So essentially, he charged two things. On the one hand, Furet had made an illegitimate leap from democracy to oligarchy to terror. And even if we want to argue with the oligarchy theorists, the so-called new Machiavellians, that oligarchy is a necessary feature of democratic order, it seems hard to believe that terror necessarily haunts democracy. And then, maybe much more grievously, Lefort said, Furet had omitted what made the revolution in part worth studying for so many generations, what made it the central event in European history, namely democratic emancipation itself. The claims of large numbers of people to emancipation from the old feudal order, which made democracy a living ideal. And so it was quite troubling to Lefort that Furet had largely omitted the early phases of the revolution in the name of getting to the terror as a necessary result of the democratic sociability. And he also omitted more moderate actors like the Girondins, or maybe more fairly, he set them up as dominoes just to fall before the inexorable force of democracy leading to terror. And this seemed to Lefort illegitimate. Democracy for Lefort through his whole career was to be celebrated. And maybe worse, as an explanatory matter, Furet had in the end failed to explain what he set out to explain. So you see at the end of the main quotation on this slide, what made for the excess of the revolution? couldn't it be necessary to recognize that the excess, i.e. the terror, was not the fulfillment but the betrayal of democracy? That's how Lefort at least wanted to see it. And yet, Furet had come very close, thanks to his conspiratorial forebears, to making democracy a conspiracy and one that led to necessary violence. One of the most amazing sentences, full stop, in Furet's book is that one I have. Democracy is not necessarily terroristic. I think it's rather amazing that you could write such a thing, as if the inference would be that it is. So I'll just conclude. As I say, I've ginned this talk up to try to be relevant to this project. I don't make any great claims for its importance. I'll just stop with 3 minor claims that this matters at all. So one, I think, is a very familiar Cambridge claim that it's worth returning to our theoretical past. The members of this group clearly aren't the first generation to try to fathom what the connection is between democracy and conspiracy. Those two terms were tried to show at the very heart of Furet's attempt to understand the most important event in modern times. Now, maybe he understood it badly, and that's my second conclusion or lesson. I think it's fair to say that we see in Furet's book, which, as I've mentioned, totally reoriented the field, the return of counter-revolutionary conspiracy theory, if you like, cleverly reworked in Carlo Ginzburg's phrase. And amazingly, it's been allowed to define the historiography of the revolution to this day. Finally, you might take a cautionary lesson from this little philological tale. It's about what happens when we don't keep our theories of democracy and our theories of conspiracy separate enough. The one, democracy, seems like a major topic. The latter, more a minor curiosity of democratic history. I mean, it transcends in importance those crackpots who have entertained conspiracy theory, but we might nonetheless want to keep conspiracy in its place, though of course that caution wouldn't at all impugn the great importance of your project. So I will stop and hope that that was of some use.
Okay, so thank you very much, Sam, and thank you. We're kind of grateful that you've made it across the Atlantic to talk to us about these topics, and I'm also grateful to Hugo for inducing you to do that. And also, just simply in terms of preserving some of the excitement of this literature, I myself come to it from a slightly different direction. I remember being in Berlin and reading in the kind of the student reading groups, Koselleck and Critique and Crisis, and the legend at the time, of course, was that he had submitted his dissertation without any footnotes, and there were various, I mean, this was the kind of the legend that circulated within our reading group. It actually is true, and he was doing that actually simply because he was working up to the very last minute to a deadline. But of course, when you read, if some of you, I presume some of you have read Critique and Crisis, then kind of like the internal architecture is so beautiful that it kind of seems to almost not need footnotes, anything as pedestrian as footnotes. You know? So I kind of come to it from the German side, and also, of course, I mean, if you're coming to it from the democracy side, I'm coming to it from within our group from the kind of the conspiracy side. So let me just begin with kind of like something which is always repeated within the literature about conspiracy theories, and that is that every conspiracy theory contains a grain of truth. And it's repeated so often that it's almost now a kind of a platitude. Furthermore, I think you could say that that grain of truth which it contains is in itself a lot of the time a platitude, a kind of a truism. If you just take the person you cited as really kind of inaugurating this counter-revolutionary conspiracy theory tradition, the Abbé Barruel, Of course, he identifies the Freemasons and the philosophers of the Enlightenment. Undoubtedly, within the 18th century, you had the Freemasons experimenting with new forms of sociability, but that doesn't mean that they were involved in a plot against the old order. And the same is true, of course, for the philosophers. Their ideas challenged the religious and the secular authorities, but that doesn't equate to a conspiracy against the old order. What I think is interesting, though, about the later people within this tradition is that it almost raises the possibility that if the conspiracy theory contains a grain of truth, and a lot of the time you have to kind of push aside the exaggeration and the distortion to get back to a fairly quotidian truth, sometimes you actually find that you get back to a truth that you did not expect. And I think that's what is occurring here with some of these conservative thinkers. And in addition to that, perhaps the other question, which is quite obvious when it comes to Furet, I mean, how possible is it to actually then extract that truth without being tainted by the conspiracy theory in which it was originally embedded? In other words, without adopting certain traits of conspiracist thought. Now, of course, when we kind of construct this tradition of Koshan, Schmidt, Koselleck and Furet, I mean, it's interesting to consider what kind of tradition it is, because they're repudiating each other quite frequently within it. But Furet, I mean, let's just take, he was not trying to perpetuate this tradition, but rather to penetrate to its inner truth. And as you indicated, I mean, this truth pertains to democracy. And in particular, I mean, just this kind of this paradoxical notion that in mass democracies, the people are supposed to govern themselves, but how actually does that occur? I mean, it's an impossibility, and you might therefore say that it's some kind of sleight of hand, or perhaps more optimistically, you'd say that it's a kind of a paradox which has to be creatively unfolded. Now, in reading Furet's works, we are we're aware of his engagement with this tradition and his efforts to mine it for insights. But of course, turning to this tradition in the 1970s, particularly when the Marxist interpretation still held sway and still was firmly entrenched within the French academic scene, it was obviously provocative for Furet to turn to Koshan. And you have to kind of admire his boldness and also the implausibility of what he is actually doing, because it begins with this essay, as you kind of indicated, the book interpreting the French Revolution is a compository text. But I mean, the first essay there begins by saying the ideological age of interpreting the French Revolution has passed. We no longer are compelled to choose sides when it comes to the French Revolution. And then almost kind of like the olive branch, which he extends to the other side, is this interpretation based upon Koshan, who would be the kind of the person least suited to fulfill that role. But nevertheless, I mean, as I said, this implausibility, why does he choose Koshan? And what I wanted to basically do was just kind of submit a possible reason, and maybe you'd like to comment upon that, but then append to that a question, which if you'd like, you can also make an attempt to answer. The possible reason simply comes, I mean, as we heard, there's Furet is obviously taking his cues from Claude Lefort and this critique of totalitarian forms of rule which had emerged on the French left. Now, of course, in doing that, he was using concepts that would not have been developed with a view of the French Revolution. And in a certain way, he was doing something, I mean, in Furet, in adopting these concepts and trying to apply them to the French Revolution, he was doing something which the Marxists themselves had done. I mean, they had taken what concepts which had been originally developed within a critique of the Industrial Revolution and had been then tried to apply them to the French Revolution. And as it turned out, a lot of those categories were fairly artificial when it came to the historical reality of the French Revolution. The question, therefore, will be, is Furet exposing himself to the same danger in doing that if he was to directly adopt Lefort's critique of totalitarian government, which of course had been developed with a view to Stalinist Russia. And of course the advantage when it comes to Koshan, as you mentioned, dies on the battlefield in 1916. 1916 is before 1917, and so obviously that's a truism also, obviously. I think there's going to be no one who disputes that. But obviously, therefore, Koshan is formulating his ideas without any reference to the Bolshevik terror, and therefore, just kind of like I was just wondering, when it comes to Koshan, to Furet taking this strange detour through Koshan to formulate his interpretation of the French Revolution, whether there was a bit of an explanation there due to the fact that Koshan, of course, had formulated that without any reference to totalitarianism. There's another matter also, of course, and this is just kind of, I just wanted to unpack some, and this ties into the question, to unpack some of the concepts. It's interesting that 1996, in the year before Furet died, he was actually in Bremen to receive the Hannah Arendt Prize, and the laudatory speech was actually given by Koselleck. And Koselleck began by reminiscing about a visit that Hannah Arendt had paid to him in Heidelberg back in 1956. Now, this is 5 years after she published The Origins of Totalitarianism. It was 2 years after Koselleck had submitted his famous dissertation, though he wasn't to publish it for another 3. But according to Koselleck, they were there, they kind of talked late into the night about totalitarianism, and it would have been interesting to have kind of been able to eavesdrop upon that conversation. Because if the concept of totalitarianism, which Hannah Arendt had developed, pairs National Socialism and Stalinist communism, then Koselleck, from a different perspective of a young soldier who had just experienced the defeat of his country and was also witnessing the geopolitical polarization of the world, he came up with another curious filiation of American liberal democracy and Stalinist communism. And this has always left me wondering what Koselleck, where he actually saw National Socialism. He seems to say that American liberal democracy and communism emerge as two perversions of Enlightenment rationality, but he remains silent when it comes to National Socialism. And I just kind of wonder whether, between submitting his PhD and actually having it published in 1959, he actually softened his kind of his critique and was not so keen about saying that basically liberal democracy is just one side of this perversion of reason, the other side being totalitarianism. Now, if we turn back to Furet, it's clear that his analysis is animated by a rejection of totalitarianism. However, in view of the fact that liberal democracy and totalitarianism form an opposition, and given that Furet's rejection is formulated on the basis of Koshan's radical critique of democracy, how does he salvage something of democracy? And of course, I think in some ways what I'm saying here is just kind of reformulating some of the queries that you yourself expressed. How does he recognize a qualitative categorical distinction between modern mass democracies with their elections and systems of representation and totalitarian systems? Perhaps even let's call them totalitarian democracies. It is clear that Koselleck was suspicious of democracy and perceived an affinity between liberal democracy and totalitarian democracy. How does it look for Furet 20 years later, who, like Koselleck, draws upon Koshan? Is liberal democracy simply a benign form of totalitarian democracy? And I think the young Koselleck might have argued that it is, and it is quite obvious that Koshan thought in those terms, but my feeling is that this equivalence of liberal democracy and totalitarian democracy, that this equivalence is perhaps already part of the error and exaggeration and distortion which tends to accrete around the inner grain of truth contained within conspiracy theories. So they're just a few thoughts. If you'd like to respond to them, then please feel free to do so. Then we can open up to the discussion.
Well, those are fantastic, especially since I didn't write this talk, and so I had nothing to give him to prepare. So, anyway, those are fantastic comments. I'll just say very quickly, I think we can credit Furet with having rightly unseated the prior form of interpreting the French Revolution in the Marxist style. That was in itself a substantial accomplishment. And I think we can also say he had some insights, since he was with others, reviving Hugo's friends from the new Machiavellian schools, into the necessarily oligarchical character of democracy. But then he makes this massive further move. And I don't see why one can't celebrate or at least credit him for the first two moves and indict him for reviving conspiracy theory when he wanted to make democracy terroristic, which then, of course, leads to your last question about how he could remain a Democrat. It's very interesting, I think, to say that every conspiracy theory contains a grain of truth, and I think we should acknowledge that it's true that the French revolutionaries were paranoid about their enemies. It's true that there are some continuities one might want to make at the focus of analysis between maybe not Masonry, but intellectual sociability in the Enlightenment and French revolutionary politics. But that, again, doesn't follow that one has to explain those connections and formulate the problems in the way that Furet did, I think, thanks to his debts to the right-wing tradition I've suggested. You make a really fascinating point about Koshan as a pre-communist figure, in a sense. And perhaps it's possible to see Furet as skirting some of the more nefarious kind of conspiracy theories that circulate, say, under the heading of Judeo-Bolshevism once communism comes about. I think I would reject that view on a few grounds. First, I mean, it's quite remarkable, but Furet clearly says in one of the quotations I put on the slide but didn't emphasize that the terror and the gulag are just identical phenomena. If we should explain the latter, we will have explained the former. And so whatever the use of his recourse to Koshan, it couldn't have been to keep these phenomena at a distance from one another. I'd further add that, of course, what is the Judeo-Bolshevik myth? Well, it's Barruel's theory with the Jews added and some later updates made once the communist revolution has taken place. One of the real claims to significance that Furet made is that we need to depoliticize the French Revolution. I mean, that was the central idea of his book, I think. He very influentially claimed that the historiography remains captive of the event. And that's what he meant when he entitled the main essay in his book, "The French Revolution is Over." My response to that is history is ineradicably political, and we are heirs of the French Revolution. And so we have a political debate that takes historiographical form. The French Revolution can never be over. And so I would regard that move as a subterfuge, a very wily one, to actually take a political side in the French Revolution, and it was the Abbé Barruel's side, ultimately. And what's remarkable is that it proved so influential. I think the reason was, well, there are a series of reasons. One is that he presented himself as a leftist, and he was. I mean, he was an anti-communist, but he understood himself as addressing socialist intellectuals. The book travels wide and far, but that was his context, and that's what he understood his goal to be. So in a sense, the new ideas he offered inadvertently got sanitized by the fact that his left-wing or progressive bona fides were so obvious. Now that wasn't his fate in his evolution. He was not only good friends with Koselleck, but he did entertain other right-wing ideas, notably in his Passing of an Illusion, which was a very famous book in its time, his connection with Ernst Nolte and others. I think the puzzle is the one you raise at the end. How at this time or in general did Furet salvage democracy? How could he claim to be any sort of Democrat when he had, after all, just written a book saying democracy is a recipe for terror? Well, I think he made it very difficult on himself, and he may not have had the resources to do it, except that everyone was a Democrat, and so he couldn't avoid being so. I think the answer is pretty stereotypical in the history of liberalism, which is Anglophilia. You know, he thought you all had never ended feudalism and kept rights and interests private and politics small. And the right way to organize democracy is to cordon off rights and interests in a private realm and make politics small about the collision of these interests. And that would never allow the democratic wildfire to catch. Now, I'm not sure that's either a fair interpretation of English history or, if it is, worth romanticizing. But many French liberals have looked across the channel and pointed to the alleged superiority of England, Voltaire and others.